Today, dear friends, is 14th February, a day dedicated to the myth of Saint Valentine of Rome and Saint Valentine of Word. It is also the day when Babur was born in 1483 at Andijan in Fargana. A very happy Valentine's Day to all of you. May love instead of hate prevail all over the world. Before we start with today's program, let me clarify one thing. I, on behalf of the Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, ASHA, would like to clearly state that though ours is a group of people associated with the Department of History AMU and the Aligarh School of History, we by no means are representatives of CAS Department of History AMU. We represent the aspirations of all those who want a secular and scientific approach towards our past. Once, this was an aspiration of most of us at Aligarh. We are a group of people who have all studied at Aligarh, with some of us still living at Aligarh. Ganga Jamuni Heritage is a Delhi-based group with similar ideals and a very strong social media presence. Please support us by your encouragement by listening in to us and disseminating our message of looking at the past as it was, free of all communal and sectarian biases. For this 34th lecture of the Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology and Ganga Jamuni, we have Dr. Imre Bangha from Oxford, UK. Dr. Bangha is Associate Professor of Hindi in Wolfson's College at the University of Oxford. He studied Indology at Budapest and holds a PhD in Hindi from Visva-Bharati. His publications include English, Hindi, and Hungarian books and articles on literature in Brajbhasha and other forms of early Hindi. Amongst his academic interests, one may count Riti poetry, classical Sanskrit aesthetics in court literature, Brajbhasha, and the works of individual poets like Vishnu Das, Kabir, Tulsi Das, Bajid, Anandghan, and Thakur. He has edited and translated a number of early Hindi modern texts. He has also written a number of monographs and books, some of which are, for example, Mother Tongue, The Emergence of a Hindi Literary Tradition, 1350 to 1520. Rekhta, Hindustani Literature Before Modern Hindi and Urdu. It's a City Showman's Show, Transcendental Songs of Anand Ghan. Yet another work of his is Bhakti Beyond the Forest, Current Research on Early Modern Religious Literature in North India, 2003-2009. Tagore Beyond His Language, and Scorpion in the Hand, Brajbhasha court poetry from Central India. Currently, he is working on the emergence of Hindi literary tradition and on the role of Hindustani before modern Hindi and Urdu. Today, Dr. Imre Bangha will speak to us on the role of Hindustani and its literary version, Rekhta, under the Mughals. Over to you, Dr. Bangha.
Thank you, Professor Rizavi. Well, I feel really honored to be part of this prestigious lecture series, and I am also very glad that it is on the 14th of February that I can present, not because it is Valentine's Day, but because it is Babur's birthday. And You will see from my lecture that Babur holds a pivotal role in the development of Hindustani and Rekhta, which hardly anyone has realized. So I am especially glad about that. Also, I'm glad to present to Aligarh, of which I cherish very fond memories. I have visited Aligarh in the 90s when I was a doctoral student, and I very fondly remember Professor Irfan Habib helping me in accessing some Indo-Persian texts. Now, I would like to share my PowerPoint, and I was told to keep my talk to about 50 minutes. I don't know whether I will be able to squeeze as much my talking to 50 minutes, and 10 minutes have already passed, but I will try my best, and maybe I will need to skip some slides.
So your time starts now. No problems. Go ahead. No issues with the time.
Right, so I'm sharing my, okay, and so hopefully my shared screen is now visible. And well, Indian languages is a fascinating theme. North India as well as South India are something which are called language areas or dialect continuums, which are like a rainbow, that it is very difficult to say when green start and where yellow ends, or where red ends and yellow starts, etc. So it would be very difficult to distinguish between the dialects and which dialect belongs to what language. Languages are social constructs, and I'm going to talk about this, how we construct languages. They are not just linguistic entities. That's only one side of the language, but I'm going to talk much more about the social side of languages. The talk is part of a project in which I am investigating what was there before modern Hindi and Urdu. And there is a colonial origin view that modern Hindi was created by the British. For example, Sir George Grierson in 1889, when he introduced in his vernacular literature of Hindustan modern Hindi, he used a very powerful wording about how much it is a colonial creation. The early 19th century witnessed the birth of that wonderful hybrid language known to Europeans as Hindi and invented by them. In 1803, under Gilchrist's tuition, Laluji Lal wrote the Prem Sagar with this peculiarity that he used only nouns and particles of Indian instead of those Arabic and Persian origin. The result was practically a newly invented speech. And you see, again, he is referring to forced into acceptance by the prestige of its inventors. However, recent research on history shows that while colonialism indeed introduced an epistemic violence, also there were important continuities, and that new colonial forms of knowledge were not just fully European, but rather they were created out of conditions that entailed considerable collaboration, intended and unintended, conscious and unconscious, wanted and unwanted, between the British and at least certain key indigenous groups. In fact, I would like to show here how much indigenous actors were able to shape Hindustani and its literary version Rekhta before it came to colonial modernity. So now I jump to another era and leave colonial modernity for a while. as I mentioned, there is a problem in what we call in our terminology, and many people refer to various things by the same words. The most conspicuous example is what language is. Some people refer to language as a singular speech form. Others take it as a general term, an umbrella term for a plethora of speech forms, which includes dialects, social acts, literary and spoken, and very many other varieties under one umbrella. Also, I would like to talk about dialect, which is a local variety normally. And English also uses the French loanword patois, which is a local dialect, a firmly rooted local dialect. And when I talked about the rainbow-like image of the dialect continuum of North India, then I was referring to the patois as the dialects proceed. And you are familiar with the saying, "Kos kos pe pani badle char kos pe boli." So that refers to patois and not to the umbrella language. When I don't want to distinguish between languages, then I would use the term lect, or when it is a literary variety, then literary idiom. For example, I cannot say that Brajbhasha and Awadhi are two distinct languages. They are two distinct lects or two distinct literary idioms. The difference between Brajbhasha and Awadhi is not much further away than, let us say, the difference between Scottish and British, or American and British English. However, it is you can clearly distinguish what is Braj and what is Awadhi. Also, it should be noted that there are no universally accepted criteria on how to distinguish between two languages. Masika, when surveying the languages of India, quotes two criteria: mutual comprehensibility, and says that perhaps the percentage of shared vocabulary can be something indication. And there are linguists who propose that if shared vocabulary is below 50%, then we speak about two distinct languages. If it is above 80%, then we speak about dialects of the same language. However, there is always a gray area between 50 and 80%. So mutual comprehensibility is not a hard and fast rule. Also, Masika mentions that maybe if we see languages as possessing written literature and dialects as not possessing written literature, but confined very much to the oral. I would like to add one criterion to Masika's, and that's political and social recognition. And that will play a very important role in the development of languages, apart from the linguistic and the literary. And as my methodology, I would like to refer to a very old but very, very influential article by Heinz Kloss, who distinguishes two types of language distinction. You can talk about languages by distance, and that's originally a German term, Abstand languages, which means languages by distance. For example, Japanese is distant from Korean, and there is no question that they are distinct languages, as Japanese is distinct from Chinese, etc. There are linguistically clear boundaries also for English before its colonial expansion, that it was confined to the British Isles. Hungarian, my mother tongue, is also such a language that it is a non-Indo-European language in the middle of Slavonic and Germanic and Romance languages, or Basque in Spain and France, again, very clearly distinct from the surrounding languages. So that's one easy thing to distinguish between languages. However, there are also languages by build-up, and this is the case when we talk about languages within a dialect continuum. Where does one language end and the dialects of one language end and the dialects of another language start? Now, this is not so much linguistic as a social buildup, and this is the situation in northern India. How can you build up a language? Again, Heinz Kloss refers to 5 criteria, but also admits that they are not universal, but it is just something that some scholars would refer to. So the lowest type of language build-up is when you use language for purely humorous or folkloristic purposes. A higher standard is when lyric poetry is present in the language, whether orally or written, it is not distinguished. A further higher stage is the appearance of prose. And we would think that prose has precedence over poetry, but in language build-up, it's the other way around. Prose appears after poetry in many literatures. Expository prose, not literary prose, is even higher. And the 5th standard is technical and scientific writing and government use. Now, this is something that most European languages have. However, South Asian languages struggle having a proper technical and scientific writing in them. University higher education is in English, and technical and scientific writing also tends to be in English, although they are present in most major South Asian languages in a reduced form. These are just five criteria that would show how languages are built up. There have been in history a debate whether modern standard languages are natural development from the spoken languages, and this is the Romantic view, which is very much indebted to Johann Gottfried Herder, the German philosopher. However, it doesn't really clarify the relationship to dialects, as how come one language becomes standard, one dialect becomes modern standard language and others don't. Sheldon Pollock recently, the American Sanskritist, has proposed that modern standard languages developed from early modern literary languages, and literary languages became supra-regional, which Pollock called cosmopolitan vernacular. So here it is literacy and literary languages that count. And for Pollock, it was not 5 phases of language build-up, but only 2 phases. First, a language is committed to writing, and secondly, high literature, belles lettres, the really high literature appears in that language. I just skipped the names, but would like to draw your attention that names referring to languages can be either localized or contrastive. Closer to the center of my talk, in Aligarh, it is not a proper question, what language is this? On the top, there is Persian. However, below is what is today termed as...
Professor Bangha, your slide is not coming, so there is some problem
no.
with the slide.
Yeah, okay, so I just skipped. Is it coming, the next one? I moved?
No, it's not coming.
Okay, right. Now?
No.
Oh. What about now?
Now it is coming.
Okay. And can you see it now?
Yeah, now I can see. Yes. Now it is moving. Yeah.
So I'm just presenting in this way when I have images. So one question that I love to ask, what language is this? And in red on the top, it is Persian, that's fine, but what is there in black? And that's what is now considered Awadhi. And this is a manuscript of the Sufi romance Chandayan. Again, I would ask, what language is this? It is Gurmukhi. However, the language is Brajbhasha. What is this script? It looks like Devanagari, but not exactly that. It is Kaithi script used in Eastern UP and in Bihar. And the elderly people told me that in Bihar and even in Eastern UP, they were taught by their father to use the Kaiti script, and this is again Brajbhasha. The three examples that I gave, neither of them is in Devanagari, in which we nowadays tend to publish Awadhi and Brajbhasha works. And let's move on. This is really a funny bit. This is Brajbhasha again, published in the Calcutta Gazette and in 1782, and first in the Bengali script and below in the Nastaliq script, and then there is an English translation of a Mukri by which later have been attributed to Amir Khusro, but not in the 18th century. And this is probably the first Brajbhasha poem in print, not in Devanagari again. Apparently the Calcutta Gazette didn't have the Nagari fonts in 1782. So one important aspect of pre-colonial language use is that script was not important. You could commit to writing literary languages in a number of scripts, although there were popular and less popular scripts. But let's move on. Another thing about multilingualism in the Mughal Empire. Once I was contacted by BBC for their series on the Mughals, asking me what language did the Mughals speak. We were thinking of High Urdu. And no, High Urdu, as we know it today, didn't exist around 1600. Abdurrahim Khane Khanan is credited with a multilingual poem, which shows his acquaintance, at least, but probably a close familiarity with several of the literary idioms. And in this quatrain, Abdurrahim Khane Khanan uses a plethora of languages. You can see there is Sanskrit, there is Braj, there is Gujarati, Marathi, Rajasthani, Khari Boli, Punjabi, Arabic, and even Telugu. Around 1600, in this multilingual environment, there were various languages at various points of language hierarchy. There were cosmopolitan high languages at play. First of all, Persian. And there is no need to remind anyone of the importance of Persian. Recently, the role of Sanskrit in the Mughal court has been drawn into the discourse, and also Arabic writing has been present in South Asia from very early time on. These were the cosmopolitan languages, but we even know about Pali compositions, Upper Brancha compositions in the 18th century, which would again be a cosmopolitan, but that's not typical, and very, very few Upper Brancha compositions appear during Mughal times. Vernaculars are more interesting, and here I would like to introduce two categories of vernaculars. You cannot really treat vernaculars in the same group as, for example, Sheldon Pollock treated, although he qualified it. But there are two types of vernaculars. One is transregional vernaculars, and the other one is much more regional vernacular. So transregional vernaculars are forms of Old Hindi and Urdu, like Hindavi. So, for example, Chandayan, its manuscript were copied as far as Khandesh and Delhi, although it was produced in Dalmau, in what is now Uttar Pradesh. Hindustani, about which I will be talking, Braj, it was much more a literary than a practical dialect. Awadhi seems to have ceded to Braj over the centuries, so by the 17th, but definitely by the 18th century, Brajbhasha was the literary transregional vernacular. Also, there was Sandbhasha, the language of Kabir and Guru Nanak, etc. However, that was also giving way to Braj, and the 18th century is under the dominance of literary Braj for literature. In the east, there was Brajabuli, which is based on Maithili of Vidyapati, but it was used from Nepal to Assam and down to Orissa. So again, a trans-regional vernacular. It is very much a stylized literary vernacular that is not very firmly rooted in one region, although Vidyapati's language definitely worked as an inspiration. Dakkani was used in the Deccan in wide ranges, first by Sufis, later by Muslim ruling elites. There were also regional languages in Rajasthan. I would rather talk about literary Marwari, not Rajasthani, that's a modern term. In Gujarat, Gujarati, in Maharashtra, Marathi, very firmly embedded in Bengal, Bengali, etc. So these were languages that were used much more in a regional setting. Are my slides visible?
They have suddenly disappeared.
Yeah.
They are coming back. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Right. And well, my typeset is quite small. I hope what I'm writing is still readable. Right. Now, there is another distinction between languages, and that's the language ecology in South Asia. You have cosmopolitan, which would be high languages in social linguistic terms. High languages, social linguists identify high languages with learning, power, and status. And there would be low languages, which would be much more the vernaculars, used very much for domestic sphere and for the evocation of emotions. Now, when I try to access the earliest poetry written by Sufis, it turns out not to be Urdu, but rather, and not Kariboli, but rather close to the mixed idiom of sants. So Hamiduddin Nagori, Abdul Qudus Gangohi, whose poetry can be documented with certainty. The same is true about Amir Khusro, and Mahmud Shirani, the great scholar, has already shown how much what we think of Amir Khusro is rather poetry from Mughal times and present in manuscripts in the 17th century or later. I have written about this elsewhere also in English. An interesting thing about the Mughals is that they experimented with new literary languages. And one new literary language for the Mughals was Rekhta, interspersed. So Rekhtan in Persian would mean to pour out, but also to intersperse. And Rekhta meant mixed language compositions for the Mughals. Also, there were vernaculars with high status aspirations. First of all, Brajbhasha, and directly or indirectly, Brajbhasha was patronized by the Mughals. And it occupies more and more space of Sanskrit learning. For example, it is not just high literary texts, texts of high literature like Keshav Das's compositions, but also languages of learning. For example, there are Brajbhasha versions on aesthetics, which was a domain of Sanskrit. Versions on other types of traditional science, musicology, also sexology, Kama Sutra, etc. Sciences, traditional sciences, appear in Brajbhasha. What was the language of the exalted court of the Mughals? Well, it was the language of the exalted court, so Zabane Urdu e Mualla. According to Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, the term around 1700 referred to Persian, but by 1800, Zabane Urdu e Mualla referred to Urdu. Now, I'm going to show some texts of Rekhta, which would be homeless texts, because they are not high Urdu, and they haven't been very much taken up by most of literary historiography, especially by Hindi literary historiography. According to Muhammad Tawakkoli Targhi, no epistemological space left for these homeless texts in the context of the new language ideologies. Let me just quote one example before I proceed. What language should this be? I have found it in a Devanagari manuscript. Dilki dilasa sari dunika tamasa kuli gamka karar duni dekhe jis oob hai baki muhabbat dekhen khatari mein yon kyu aave alam ki sahibi to aisi jasi hudoob hai. This looks very much like Urdu, however, not standardized and also written in the Devanagari script. I have found this Devanagari text in a manuscript dated 1654, and it is introduced as Rekhta. This is one of the first examples of the term Rekhta being applied to a literary language. But let's see the history of this of Rekhta. As I mentioned, early attempts to link Rekhta to Amir Khusro and other poets, whether Hindu or Muslim. Amongst the Hindus, Namdev is also credited with Rekhta-like compositions. And this has already been studied in detail. There is a 5-volume Tarikh-e Adab-e Urdu Sattara Sota by Saida and Jafar, and they have studied claims for early Urdu, and in the lack of manuscripts or reliable means of transmission, we cannot say with certainty about any of pre-Mughal texts from North India in Kariboli that they are genuine. So, however, with the Mughals, and here comes Babur. So happy birthday, and this is what is the first firmly documented composition in what we can call Rekhta or even Urdu, and it is there in Babur's Turkish Divan in a manuscript dating from 1529. I am quoting most of the text in transliteration if there is no specific need for Devanagari or Urdu script. It is only one couplet, but very firmly documented couplet about Babur, Mujhka by Babur in his Divan. He has got divans in Chagatai and in Persian, and this is, however, in Rekhta. Mujhka na hua kuch havase maane ka moti, fakhr ehliga bas bulgusidur pani or roti. A peculiarity is that apart from Hindustani and Persian elements, it also has Chagatai Turkish, fakr ehliga bas bulgusidur, for poor people sufficient are. Another interesting thing, and this is really getting close to Babur's language, is that he was not able to pronounce, to distinguish between ta and ta. So he can rhyme moti with roti. This would not be acceptable to later poets more firmly rooted in the South Asian environment. However, the first documented Rekhta from North India comes from Babur. Mahmud Sherani has presented in detail an album written by a person called Jaimal Tal in between 1652 and 56. So it is a dated album in the Nastaliq script, which mostly has Persian compositions, but many compositions in the mixed language. By Jamali, Faizi, Bairam, Jani, Sedan, Fateh Muhammad, Jafar, and an unknown author. We can suspect that Faizi is the court poet in Akbar's court, and Bairam, we may not be sure, but the famous Bayram Khan comes as a candidate, as an author, if we are within the Mughal court. Sheikh Jamali Kambo is an interesting figure, and I'm relying on Mahmoud Sherani's research. So, but probably I just skip. And an important thing is, before the Mughals, the Mahdavis' use of mixed language, and some of their poetry is written down. The Mahdavis, who are credited with the Hindavi compositions are Miran Sayyid Muhammad of Jaunpur, then Sayyid Khandmir Matufi, and Mian Mustafa. So the early Rekhta of Mian Muhammad of Jaunpur is something that Persian poetry in which you have Hindavi forms. Agar fazal kuniyak jo jive jive jive, agar adal kuniyak jo muve muve muve. So I'm presenting Persianate elements in bold typeset and Hindustani elements in normal typeset. We know about Persian poets from Humayun and Akbar's time who also experimented with Rekhta. And these poems appear in an album which was possibly written between 1556 and 1572, so quite early. Again, this early Rekhta was a clear mixture of Persian and Indic elements. I just read out a line or two. Khar shudam, zar shudam, lut gaya, dar rahe ishq tu kamar tutta hai. Garchi bedam guft raqim kuttan, uska kaha mat karo, ye jhutta hai. This is one type of early Rekhta. Why were people using Rekhta and mixed language? There have been various arguments proposed by various scholars. So proselytizing or integration, powers of patronage, genre and context, moving emotions and invoking a domestic female tone. And I would add to this the innovative and hybridizing spirit of the early Mughal court, and also virtuosity. For example, when we see Rahim's poem in 8 or 12 languages, that's definitely a show of virtuosity, and didn't have any practical value because probably there were not many people who would understand all these languages. Just some funny thing, Ishki Khan, who is supposed to have died in 1582, according to Sherani, but I wasn't able to find out any further information about him. And there is a suspicion that the poem attributed to him is not from Akbar's time, but rather from Aurangzeb's time. However, I would be very happy to receive any comment if you can help me to locate Ishq Khan in history. So in his Persian composition, Sardo Garmi Zamana, he presents a nobleman who has Indian, Turkish, and Persian wives. And this is how the Indian wife welcomes the husband. Zani Hindi zi ek taraf guyad, hoon tiri londi tu mira khandagar. तुम जो मुझको प्यार करते हो, होम भी करती हूँ तिहारा प्यार. अपने कोठे पे मैं बिछाऊं पलंग, उस ऊपर लेट जियो पांव पसार. बीच तुम लेट लोंदियां चौगिर्द, हरमान आसपास तुम बचकार. So this is how a wealthy nobleman is received. Now, if the nobleman becomes poor, this is what the wife says. Zani Hindi zi ek taraf guyad. तेरी माँ गोली तेरा बाप चमार, झूठ तुझ थेम बहुत सुना मत बोल, सच तिरा हो कहो मेरा मत मार. तुझ थेम मुझको न रोटी ओ पानी, तुझ थेम मुझको नहीं सवादो सिंगार. अब न रहूं तेरे खुदा की सौं, निकलूंगी तिहारे घर थेम बहार. These sort of Rekhta compositions, which I have so far mentioned, were recorded in the Urdu or Nastaliq script. However, we have recorded examples of Rekhta also in the Devanagari script. Dadu Dayal, this pad attributed to Dadu Dayal with high likelihood was written down in a manuscript dating from the 1630s. And this Rekhta reads as Allah, Tera jikar fikar karte hain, aase ka mustaq tere, tarasi tarasi marte hain. And just go to the end. Jaan tera, jind tera, paun sir dharte hain, dadu diwan tera, jar kharid ghar ke hain. And Rekhta was taken up by syncretistic authors like Dadu Dayal and also by Hindus. Another syncretistic author, Bajid, who was present around 1600, I'm just quoting some lines from him. Gopi gai gwalanito behala ham bihari bin hotana malum makasud kiya tumhara hai. This is in the Indic poetic form of Kavita, however, in Kariboli, in Persianized Kariboli. And I'm just trying to show the manuscript, probably it is visible, and the text starts where my pointer is. Gopi, Gwal, Gaya, Tobe, Hala, Ham, Bihari, Bin, etc. And even Vaishnava Hindus, who were not really part of the syncretistic movement, would use Kariboli, Persianized Kariboli. So one such example is attributed to Swami Haridas, who lived in the 16th century. Bande akhtiyar bhala, chitana dulava ava samadhi bhitara nahohu agala. Last line, kahi Haridas karta kiya so hua, sumera achala chala. So there were Rekhta compositions from the early Mughal times onward, both committed to writing both in the Nastaliq and the Persian script and the Devanagari script. Now, I'm coming to Hindustani. When we try to go beyond the literary, these literary Rekhta compositions are one thing, but what about the practice? Hindustani before 1720, so before Wali's Divan comes to Delhi and creates a new literary genre, a new literary style, and a new literary language, what do we know about Hindustani before 1720, or before it was standardized into Urdu first and later, much later, 100 years later, to Hindi? So its grammar is something which is called Kariboli. Ramvilas Sharma has argued that Kariboli is rooted in the dialect spoken in Haryana around Delhi, Banguru. However, its phonology and certain features are much more features that show some more southern influence from Agra and from Brajbhasha. For example, in Banguru, there is retroflex ana, there is retroflex ala, and these features disappear from Hindustani. And Ramvilas Sharma argued it was because this initial Banguru Hindustani template was transposed into a southern region with the capital in Agra. The vocabulary is Hindi and Perso-Arabic, and it has a really marked Perso-Arabic vocabulary, unlike modern Hindi. It is attested by travelers and missionaries, and also by early foreign grammarians. Amongst them, I would like to mention the two earliest grammarians, Johann Joshua Catelar and François-Marie de Tours. The first one was an adventurer, the second one was a missionary. The first grammar was, which is to the left corner of my slide, is presents the language in the Roman script. However, François-Marie de Tours presents the language in the Devanagari script. Hindustani is attested by travelers, and I would like to mention John Fryer, who was a doctor of the East India Company. The language of the court is Persian, that commonly spoke is Hindustan, for which they have no proper character, the written language being called Banyan. I think Banyan is a misunderstanding of Braj, which is a mixture of Persian and Slavonian, i.e. Indian vernacular, as are all dialects of India. So Fryer just thinks that Persian influence is ubiquitous in India. There was literary output in Dakkani and Gujri, and the language was not standardized. There were academic attempts to link Dakkani to Marathi, Gujarati, and Punjabi. However, Hindustani had a limited literary output in the north before the 1720s, and it has been denied, especially the Nagari Hindustani has been just omitted from literary histories of both Hindi and Urdu. However, this language was used for practical transactions, and I would like to quote here François-Marie de Tours. The use of this Indian or Moghalian language in all its details may be a most easy and indispensable practicability, supplying a method that may lead the missionaries in their undertakings of missions, help the merchants in their practicing of business, and always accompany wayfarers when following the roads, traversing and wandering through different regions. It seems suitable to leave aside the Brahmanic, that is Sanskrit, and the vernacular languages, that is the dialects, and to keep to the Indian or Moghalian and study and engage in discourse according to its rules and laws. So this is the view from outside. Now, what about Indian authors? I would like to quote here Prannath. He was a syncretistic religious preacher, and his composition Sanand is deeply engages with the question of language in two verses. I quote the Hindustani first. Sabko pyari apni jo hai kul ki bhak, ab kahun bhakha mein kinki, yamen to bhakha hai lakh. Bina hisabe boliyam mine sakal jahan, sabko sugam janake kahungo Hindustan. So the argument here is that sabko sugama janke, that accessible to all, I will speak in Hindustani. And in fact, this is what is attested also by missionaries. And I have a beautiful image of an Indian missionary baptizing Indians, even if missionary efforts in North India were mostly unsuccessful in converting large groups. There is a very interesting text that comes out of this. And that's the text of Giuseppe Maria da Gargnano, an Italian Capuchin missionary, and his work is called Jawab Swal Aik Christian or Aik Hindu ke beech mo iman ke upar. And this text was produced in the kingdom of Betia in northwestern Bihar. The two grammars that I have mentioned by Katalar and Marie de Tours was produced in Surat, so quite far away. However, both those grammars and this text presents Hindustani, but the Bihar Hindustani has local inflections. The authorship of the text is not so clear. Normally, we would call it composed by da Gargnano. However, he had the help of a Capuchin friend and colleague, as well as an unnamed Brahmin teacher, and he acknowledges having learned the language from that teacher and who has polished the language of the text. And he calls the language Hindui Boli. And a copy of this Hindustani text was first presented to the Raja of Betia in 1751, and consequently an undetermined number of handmade copies were distributed among persons in Betia area. So how does this language look like? So this is a missionary text from 1751. Parameswar ne आदमियों को पैदा करी के उन्हों को एक ईमान दिया है संसार को समझाने को किस काम के वास्ते हम लोगों को दुनिया में रखा है. Now I show you the manuscript, which is Daguarniano's hand. Quite difficult to read initially, but after some time one can get used to it. I just show the pointer. Jawab sawal ek Christian और एक हिंदू के बीच, choice above, mo iman ke upar. It's a kind of Kaiti script. So this is what missionaries instructed by a Brahmin found useful language to learn and to communicate with Indians in the middle of the 17th century. It is not a language created by missionaries, although they had to create terms for Christian things, but normally they used Hindu terms, sometimes qualified Hindu terms. For example, for God, they would use Parameshwar. So this is one type of Hindustani prose, and this is the first example of Hindustani prose. Even if the missionaries distributed this text in handwritten format to various people in Betia, it seems that no one wanted to imitate this prose, and it didn't have any perceptible impact on language use. Another instance of the use of Hindustani, and now it is a legal language, certificate of the inhabitants of Benares addressed to the Honorable Company and the Governor General Warren Hastings in support of Ali Ibrahim Khan. And I am grateful to Nandini Chatterjee for drawing my attention to this document, and she has presented this document in several articles. Now, it is written in various scripts by various people in various languages, and some of the idioms used is Hindustani. For example, here I will just read Nawab, Amirul Mamalik, Governor, General Bahadur के इकबाल से वो प्रजा के भाग से नवाब वो प्रजा के भाग से नवाब इब्राहिम अली खां बहादुर काशी के हाकिम हैं. ईश्वर यह हाकिमी दायम कायम रहे, जो लिखा है सो सब सही, सब ब्राह्मण राजी हैं, आशीर्वाद देते हैं कि कंपनी सलामत रहे, जिसके राज में ऐता सुख है. So all this is the use of Hindustani before it was standardized into modern Hindi. And these examples in the Devanagari script, as I go towards the middle of the 17th century, I'm quoting Devanagari examples because in Delhi, the new developments are already underway in formulating a high literary language from Hindustani. So turning Rekhta into Zabane Urdu e Mualla. And first of all, Wali Dakkani's impact coming from the south, whether Gujarat or the Deccan, is discussed very much in detail by Shamsur Rahman Farooqi in early Urdu literary culture, or Urdu ka ibtidai zamana. So that's the first thing, that poets start to imitate Wali's style and language use. And also at the same time, an ideological framework is worked out. How should a new Indic language be? And standardization starts to take place. Two names are especially important: Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu and Shah Hatem. Shah Hatem is especially important. He purifies his own divan according to various criteria, And I'm quoting some of the criteria here. Perso-Arabic pronunciation favored over indigenous ways, and not just pronunciation, but Perso-Arabic spelling. So you are not satisfied with one type of sa, but you would need to write se or swad whenever required by the Perso-Arabic. In Dakhani, very often you just had a simple scene for all the sounds. Removal of Hindavi Bhakha words, that's also one of the criteria of Shah Hatim, is emphasis on established idiom, and he completely ignores the possibility of writing the language in the Nagari script. Furthermore, there is an emergence of poetic tradition in Urdu and new centers. And according to Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, when Shah Alam II returns to Delhi in 1772, Urdu, along with Persian, is recognized as the language of power. And after that time, people can use the term Zabane Urdu Mu'alla to refer to this language. And the first grammar of the language is by Insha'Allah Khan in 1807, the Darya-e-Latafat. The important thing about the development of Urdu is that this is the first Indian vernacular that has been modernized into a really modern language, and it was done without colonial influence. The only thing colonial influence might be that Insha'Allah Khan might be aware that a grammar is important for a language. But otherwise, it is a fully indigenous development into a language. However, early Orientalist scholarship, and now we are in the Oriental era, and I would like to draw attention to what happens to Hindustani under the early Orientalist scholarship. And we shouldn't look at this with the eyes of the high Orientalist scholarship that was presented by Grierson. So they drew on European ideas about language as expression of national identity, and this would mean that a language for Hindus should be Sanskritized, and the language for Muslims should be Persianized. And Sir William Jones and Nathaniel Hallhead tried to identify Hindu and Muslim languages. And furthermore, print dictionaries and grammars helped reinforce the trends towards developing vernacular languages. Fort William College played an important role. However, it did not play as important role as later Orientalist scholarship claims. It was the first institution to teach Indian languages to aspiring colonial officers. It had publications, and it had departments according to languages. And it is important, it had Arabic, Hindustani, Bengali, Sanskrit, plus Marathi and Chinese departments. There is no Persian, and Chinese is there. Also, there is no Hindi. There is only one Hindustani department, which after 3 or 4 years employed Hindi munshis, but within the Hindustani department. Gilchrist is the person behind Fort William College and especially of behind Hindustani department. However, his grammar of the Hindustani language includes mostly Urdu examples and a little bit of Brajbhasha. And neither was Gilchrist nor were Fort William College officers keen on separating the two languages. They would rather think of continuity, and many Fort William College publications were published both in the Nagari and in the Urdu script. There is Prem Sagar, about which I have written elsewhere, which is rather an exception to the rule that it was a highly Sanskritized text, but it was published probably on the insistence of Rallu Lal and not Gilchrist. For Gilchrist, the concept of Hindustani was that a language is a continuum of registers and varieties. Remember, in the beginning, I talked about the umbrella languages, how many things, how many aspects a language can include. Many books were published both in Urdu and Nagari script and employed separate Hindi Bhakha and Hindustani munshis. And he also asked Hindi munshis to experiment with depersianized Hindustani in the Nagari script, but that was only a one-off experiment by Lallu Lal. Sadal Mishra also produced works, but Fort William College never published Sadal Mishra's works in depersianized Hindustani. The majority of Fort William publications were either Brajbhasha or Hindustani Urdu. The separation of Hindustani and the breakup of Hindustani happened much more under Bharatendu Harishchandra and Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi in the late 19th and early 20th century under high colonialism, especially under the events of 1857. So just to conclude, languages have their dynamics of build-up. So languages need to be built up. And languages are never constant categories. They fight for prestige and recognition and social acceptance. North India has always been a multilingual place, and there were continuities in the early colonial attitude towards language use, which have not been emphasized, but recent scholarship draws more and more attention to this. And I would like to finish with a quote from Francesca Orsini's article from 2019 about this phenomenon. While historiography has come to a more gradual view of the colonial takeover and emphasizes the dynamic role played by groups and individuals who took advantage of the political vacuum in competition and collaboration with the increasingly powerful East India Company, literary historiography still starkly narrates the turn from pre-colonial to colonial culture as a complete epistemic shift. This is exemplified by the prevailing model of Western impact and response. And I think the history of Hindustani illustrates this very well. High colonialism has led to the obscuring of the existence of Hindustani, and it was the agency, both colonial and indigenous agency, that led to the separation of Hindi and Urdu, and this happened very much under high colonialism. Before colonial impact, however, there was a Hindustani that was used by a wide range of people for a wide range of purposes. And one use of Hindustani was elevating it to the language of Zabani Urdu e Mualla. Another use of Hindustani was keeping it unstandardized and trying to reach out to people, whether for missionary or for administrative purposes. So thanks for your attention, and I will be happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you very much for a very brilliant, lecture, in the sense that in less than an hour, you were able to cover such a wide topic of yours. At least as far as I am concerned, I have gained much from your exposition on the topic. Let us see if there are any questions which the people who have been watching have. Hassan Aziz asks a question. Sir, how the Mughal conquest of Deccan under Aurangzeb contributed to the spread of Rekhta or Urdu in southern India? And other than Bahadur Shah Zafar, which Mughal emperors were proficient in Urdu?
Well, good questions. I didn't. I wanted to avoid both aspects. The question of Deccan, because Deccan would need a full-fledged research, and we have Padamrao already from the 1420s, a very early Deccani work, which attests the spread of Hindustani, an early form of Hindustani, to the Deccan. However, so Deccani was very much present before Aurangzeb in the Deccan, but High Urdu arrived to the Deccan much later. Now, when we term literary idioms as Rekhta or Gujari or Deccani, this is very much our terming of the literary idiom. Normally, if I find a literary Hindustani text in North India, I term it Rekhta for the sake of consistency. If I find a similar Kariboli-based language in the Deccan, I would term it Deccani. And if it comes from Gujarat, I would term it Gujari. And you would also look for further influences on these texts. For example, Rekhta has a palpable influence from Brajbhasha. Deccani has influence, interestingly, from Punjabi and also from southern languages, Marathi and Telugu especially. Gujari has an influence of Gujarati, so those who are trained on this probably can point at these features, but I think these features will never be beyond controversy. So I don't think Aurangzeb's campaign contributed very much to the spread of Rekhta. Deccani was already there and was more flourishing, in fact, in the Deccan than in Aurangzeb's court, Rekhta in Aurangzeb's court. It was when Urdu emerged in Delhi in the middle of the 18th century, and I talked about new centers. The first new center was Lucknow, and later Hyderabad became one of the centers of Urdu. Lahore became a center of Urdu. Even Bihar, Patna became a center of Urdu at a certain time. It was big cities that became centers of Urdu. And that was not due to Aurangzeb's conquest, but in Hyderabad, I would say it was the Nizams who promoted Urdu on the expense of Deccani. Yeah, and yes, shall we move on?
Yeah, there is another question that Ali Heather asked a question. Sir, how the transition of Rekhta into Urdu happened, and why Rekhta started being called Urdu, which literally means army in Turkish?
So it means army in Turkish. In fact, it's a Mongolian word, loan word, so traveled quite long from Mongolian into Turkey, and from Turkey into Persian, and then into Hindustan. Here, the primary meaning of Urdu, when we use it as a language, comes as an abbreviated form of Zabane Urdu-e Mu'alla, the language of the Exalted Court, the language of the Mughal court, and you would say the language of the highest social prestige, if I want to translate this. And well, it takes so long to say Zabane Urdu-e Mu'alla, so simply people abbreviated it into Urdu. However, the meaning was not army by that time, but it was the Exalted Court. Now, the original meaning, why the Exalted Court was called a camp, you can grasp it that the early Mughals did not stay in one place. Definitely not Babur and Jahangir, Babur and Humayun, but even Akbar moved from places to places. It was only after Muhammad Shah that the Mughals were firmly rooted in Delhi. Muhammad Shah didn't have much place to move anyway, as the empire fragmented. But before that, the Mughals were on the move, and they had their camp, and that was their center. And this is how Urdu came to be implied to the Mughal court.
In fact, if I may add a little to what Imre Bangha is just saying, that there was a term, Urdu Zafar Kareen, which was a term which was used for wherever the emperor was at that particular moment of time. He may be having set up his camp or tents in a village or in some city. That place would be known as Urdu e Morla or Urdu e Zafar Kareen, and whatever coins would be struck there would be given the name of Urdu e Zafar Kareen such and such place. So, I mean, as he pointed out, that the term Urdu may have meant army in the initial stages of the term, but later on it had a change of meaning and change of sense. And at the point where it was being used as the language Urdu e Molla, it was probably Imre would, in fact, correct me. It only meant the language of the court. At one point of time, for example, 19th century or 18th century, when you have this development of Urdu in the Awadh court, that is supposed to be the language of the court. Apart from that, there's another question by Ela Mahfouz Priye. Even today in India, particularly North India, there is no proper language among common mass. There are dialects. How much is it difficult to predict the language of common mass during Sultanate period?
Well, we have a very fragmentary material from the Sultanate period, and I tried very hard to find Kariboli from the Sultanate period. We don't have any literary work in Kariboli from the Delhi Sultanate. What we have, Padamrao, etc., are from the south. And when I look at the use of Hindavi, of Sufis, then it is not in Kariboli. Chandayan is in Proto-Awadhi. Abdul Quddus Gangohi is in a language which is like Kabir. Also, Hamiduddin Nagori, who lived in the middle of the 14th century, again used a language similar to Kabir. So it is not, we cannot document Kariboli from the Sultanate period. However, the fact that Hindustani reaches the Deccan, and there are Hindustani Dakkani compositions, and I would call Dakkani as a kind of branch of Hindustani. There are Dakkani compositions in the south. It attests to the presence of a Proto-Hindustani already in the Sultanate period, but we can only infer to this language. There are sometimes Hindustani sayings of Sufis recorded in their Malfuzas, but very, very brief sayings that someone calls Bhaiya, someone else. We cannot really reconstruct what kind of Hindustani we had in the Sultanate period. It is in sharp contrast with the Mughal period, from which we have really a wide range of data. Much of this has been ignored, though.
Before we take up other questions which are being put up there is one query from Suresh Balchandani. Suresh Balchandani has in fact given a statement. He says that I thought Mughals spoke Chagtai. Their books were also written in Chagtai, starting with Babarnama.
Yes. Well, the mother tongue of Babur was a Turkic language. Chagatai is already a literary Turkish language. And the Mughals took special care of their Chagatai heritage, and they taught their children Chagatai. However, even Babur, who composed his Baburnama in Chagatai Turkish, he had divans already in Persian and in Chagatai, so in two languages. Later, you can see from the other documents from North India, Chagatai is sporadically present, and it is Persian that is taken up by the Mughals. And Muzaffar Alam has argued that Akbar had made a choice for Persian. Humayun was helped by Persians, so that's one thing. So they were grateful to the Persians. And Muzaffar Alam argues that at a time when the Suris started to move away from Persian towards Hindavi, Hindustani, and they had bilingual edicts and went towards bilingualism, Mughals in their administration didn't support bilingualism but went for Persian. And this might be because Akbar did not want to continue the tradition of the Afghans, the Suris, which were happier with the local Indic languages. He did not want to continue Chagatai. He already had rivals up in Kabul, and his throne was not secure. And he did not want to promote a clientele of his competitors. So Persian seemed to be the obvious option for him. I have also, let's stop here. So from Akbar's time, definitely, Chagatai was present, was taught to Mughal children, but it was Persian that was the primary language of administration and of literary expression. It is not no wonder that the translator of Baburnama, Abdur Rahim Khan-e-Khanan, composed in Persian. His major work is in Persian, and he had to translate the Baburnama into Persian precisely for the Mughals, because their knowledge of Chagatai was something like the Urdu knowledge of a second or third generation American Indian.
Right. I mean, I would like to just comment further that I mean, although Muzaffar Alam has tried to argue that Akbar preferred Persian, but the fact remains that even during the Delhi Sultanate, most of the texts were written in Persian. Persian had become the language of the court even before the coming of the Mughals.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you look at all the literature which was compiled during the Sultanate period, even during the period when the Afghans and others were ruling. So, whether they were the Khaljis, the real Turks, the Ilbari Turks, or they were the Afghans before the coming of the Mughals, they were all writing in Persian, and that was a tradition which was continued. Now, Babur did compose his Baburnama in Chagatai Turkish, but it was this tradition, as Imre Bangha just pointed out, was never carried forward. So much so that these Turkish traditions, including the language, are commented upon by Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni. You know, when once in the court of Akbar, one Central Asian cousin was coming, Akbar ordered that the old Chagatai rules and traditions should be laid out to welcome the cousin, the ruler of Kabul. But Badayuni says that these Chagatai traditions were just like Naksha Bar Aab, drawing a sketch on water. As soon as the person left, everything went off. Even Babur's own daughter, Gulbadan Bano Begum, wrote her account in Persian, not in Chagatai. In fact, it would not be wrong to say that the language of the literates was Persian during that period, and that is true for the Ottoman Empire, who were the Turks. That was true for the Safavids, who were originally Turks. They were originally Turks. They were a Turkish group, came to occupy Iran. They adopted this Persian language. The Uzbeks, they were following the Persian traditions. The Mughals, they were following the Persian tradition. So, in fact, the aberration was the Chagtai Turkish, which only Babur used for some time. And I would respectfully not agree with the what Muzaffar Alam has said, that it is only from as if no other language flourished, and it was the Persian which was given, as Imre Bangha himself has pointed out, that almost all type of dialects and languages were being spoken and were being promoted. The recent researches of Francesca Orsini or Audrey Truschke, Imre Bangha himself have shown that even other languages, apart from Persian and Arabic, were being promoted by the Mughals. I'm sorry I gave this long answer to you. Khalida Khan, wasn't there a Persianate culture across what is now Central Asia, Persia, Turkey? That is what I am pointing out. That is what I said. Uh, 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 you know, can you recommend any books for lay people on this subject?
Well, I would recommend still Muzaffar Alam's The Languages of Political Islam, which argues precisely for this, that there was an Ajam culture, an Eastern Islamic culture, which used Persian, which was different from the Maghreb, the Western Islamic culture that used Arabic. Also, I would like to add to this, Marco Polo, the Italian traveler, knew only Persian and was able to communicate in China in Persian. And Persian was used as far away as Korea. So it was very much a Silk Route language as well. I would compare Persian to French. French about 100 years ago was the language of culture. Probably not so much not so much in Britain, but even I think British passports 100 years ago were issued both in English and in French. That was the language of diplomacy. And if you wanted to show that you belong to a cultural elite, then you used French. And there are French loanwords in Turkish and not even in Persian, as it spread so far away. And as languages are dynamic entities, Persian has lost its status, and now it is not a language of communication throughout these vast territories. The same way French is now only used in the French-speaking countries, and a few people who want to study French can study it, but it is not anymore a diplomatic language.
Well, there is a query by Ali Haider. Sir, was Urdu ever Musalmani or identified as Moorish language?
Very good question. Well, both are terms that the British would use. Moorish is a term that the British used in the 18th century for Urdu. However, I would say it was much more for Hindustani. And I wouldn't talk about Urdu before it was really elevated to that high standard language. I would call it Old Urdu. So Hindustani can be called Old Urdu, or it can be called Old Hindi, just to make it clear that these are non-standardized languages with very fluid orthography, pronunciation, and vocabulary.
And they had nothing to do with religion also.
No. Moorish would just be a general term by the British to the Indians ruled by the Moors, i.e. the Muslims. But it was not as widespread term as we would think. As you remember, the quote I quoted from the 17th century by the British doctor calls the language Indostan. And in fact, in the 17th century, the language was called Hindustan, not even Hindustani, interestingly, in several sources.
Well, there is a comment by Suresh Balchandani. He says Aurangzeb had no interest in culture or art. He was focused on spread of Islam with sword. He spread death and destruction in southern India. Zafar was opposite to Aurangzeb in terms of culture, but then he had no military to do damage. I think the question or the comment is based on wrong presumptions. Uh, you know,
I would.
the
Can I just intervene?
yeah, yeah.
I would recommend, as a scholar, I would recommend Audrey Truschke's monograph as the latest research on Aurangzeb, who is an outsider, so wouldn't take sides with Hindus or Muslims in how Aurangzeb should be taken. And I would really recommend her research on this question. She is one of the most outstanding scholars of the 17th century Mughal India.
Even as far as culture is concerned, the developments which took place under Aurangzeb are have no parallel. Rag Darpan. You say that Aurangzeb was a Puritan. The whole development of music took place under Aurangzeb. The Rag Darpan was compiled by Aurangzeb during the period of Aurangzeb. There were not only Rag Darpan, but there were other texts of music which were not only written but were popularized during the period of Aurangzeb. As far as architecture is concerned, there was also no decline under Aurangzeb. And we find very beautiful examples. For example, the Padshahi Mosque of Lahore, the Jame Masjid of Lahore, is the best example of Mughal architecture if you minus Taj Mahal. It's one of the most beautiful mosques ever constructed. Similarly, in the field of paintings, the only thing was that no new innovations were made. You were correct that Aurangzeb was busy in wars. He fought not only with Shivaji and the Marathas, but also against the Muslim rulers of Bijapur and Golconda. So most of his time was, in fact, passed in the conquests. And also remember that how he came to the throne. He came to the throne not due to any help of the Turks or the Iranians. He came to the throne with the help of the Rajput nobility. Remember also the Nishan which Aurangzeb issued to Rana Raj Singh. So, in fact, Aurangzeb is, I won't say that he was an angel. No ruler is an angel. Always remember, their rulers, kings, no kinship. They have no relations. And kings have no religion. They are only rulers and nothing else. So to say that would be, I think, misrepresenting the history of sorts. During his period, as Imre pointed out, although he didn't dilate on that issue, but even in the languages, the local indigenous languages also were developing during the period of Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, much before 1720s, and we can have a separate discussion on that. Are there any other questions? Well, I think this has been answered. There is a question on contribution of Delhi Sultanate and Mughal Empire to the introduction of Urdu. I think he has answered this question. There was question on Amir Khusro, I think, something related with Amir Khusro. Did Amir Khusro know Urdu? Uh, mm, Imre Bangha has already pointed out that there is no question of any of Amir Khusro knowing Hindi or Urdu or talking about those languages. Uh, the fact remains, Dr. Banga, that Amir Khusro does make a mention of the Hindavi dialects. In fact, some of the authors have wrongly translated Hindavi in singular. Although, if you really pay attention to what Amir Khusro has written in No Sepeher, when he mentions Hinduvi, he is mentioning it in plural and then qualifying it with, for example, you pointed out about Gujarati dialect. He includes Kannada. He includes the language which was being spoken in the Delhi region, Dehlavi. Yeah. He speaks about Braj. He speaks about the other type of languages which were indigenous, not languages, but they were the dialects which were being spoken by the people. But as Imre Banga has pointed out, that we don't actually get any examples, concrete examples of those, Hinduvi, languages or dialects which are now, said to have been composed by Amir Khusro Dehlavi himself.
Let me just add to this that Amir Khusro himself says that I have composed songs in Hindavi or Dehlavi, but they are not worth writing down. Now, this, if you remember, I presented a chart with the various language levels. So Amir Khusro definitely considered the Indian spoken languages inferior to Persian and Arabic. Maybe Sanskrit might have been called Zaban too, but they were not even called Zaban. He uses a very eccentric term, a kind of traditional speech forms for the Indic languages in his list. However, the problem with Amir Khusro is that what is attributed to him are very likely 17th century compositions or 18th century compositions. And Mahmud Sherani showed a composition attributed to Jafar, a person called Jafar, and very, very famous. And well, you are familiar with it, I'm sure. It is present in an album written down in 1652-56 under the name of Jafar. And by the time we reach to the 18th century, and we have albums from of the same song, same Rekhta from 1717 or something, it appears under the name of Amir Khusro. And the Rekhta is, and you know this Rekhta, Zihale Miskin Makuntagaful, Duraye Nanan, Banaye Batian, Duraye Nanan, etc. And this is the earliest recorded version is by Jafar and not by Amir Khusro. So over the times, it happens in India that many songs are attributed to Kabir, which were not by Kabir, to Mirabai, which were not by Mirabai, to Surdas, etc. So the early Surdas corpus includes about 500 songs. By the 20th century, we have 5,000. So in a way, the famous Amir Khusro songs are just, we are not able to say what Amir Khusro has composed. He composed in Hindavi, which was the dialect of Delhi. And it is not recorded. He himself writes that they are not worth writing down.
Well, I would recommend, at least to the students who are listening in, that there is a very small booklet meant for non-historians, even for historians, written by Professor Irfan Habib, Medieval India, published by NBT, National Book Trust. And there is, you know, two chapters on language and literature, one for the Sultanate period, one for the Mughal period. And in 3 or 4, 5 pages, he has given a brief information about these whole, I mean, what we were discussing today, the development of literature and language under the Sultans of Delhi and under the Mughals. So I would recommend that please do read that to get a better idea. Because I am saying that, Imre, because I mean, all those who listen to us include all type of people. So for them, this information is that if there is some problem, this is a very small book, a very light book. You can go through it. I must thank Dr. Imre Bangha once again that he actually enlightened us today with much information which is usually not talked about these days. These days, the only refrain is that there was a separation between communities in languages, in our thinking, in everything. But as Imre Bangha's lecture today shows, that at the ground, there was a mixing of the communities, the mixing of languages. One thing, Dr. Bangha, which probably due to shortage of time, you could not take up naturally, to sum up everything, to incorporate everything within an hour is next to impossible. There is something which I would draw your attention to, and probably you know about it, that you know, in the Persian sources of Mughal period, starting with Akbarnama and going up till Shah Jahan's period, most of these, you know, chronicles have used terms which are not Persian, which are in fact Hindavi terms. I'll just, for the audience, I'll give you an example that, you know, Langot, for example. Abul Fazal mentions, I mean, you remember what type of ornate language which Abul Fazal is using. It's a very ornate language, Persian, highly stylized Persian, in which Akbarnama is written. But within that, there are umpteen of examples of the Hindavi terms being used. As when Tuzuk is being written, because Jahangir probably is looking towards his, you know, Central Asian origins or whatever, he uses explanations. In Turkish, this thing is called such and such. But Abul Fazal, wherever he has to explain something, he is using the terms which are known as Hindavi terminology. So it's there. Not only that, but you know, by Shah Jahan's time, there is an account which was written, on which we had a discussion only a day back, Zakhiratul Khawanin. And in Zakhiratul Khawanin, as Lubna Irfan talked day before yesterday, it's a book which has compiled the biographies of the nobles from Akbar down to Shah Jahan's period. While dealing with these biographies and narrating the incidents which happened in their life, there are a large number of Hindavi terms which have been used there. If you remember that even a proverb which was of Hindi was read out to you by Lubna Irfan there. Apart from that, there is another work, probably Imre Bangha must have seen it, that is known as Tazkira Pir Hassu Teli. This is, you know, a metrical account of a oil presser saint of Lahore who was a Muslim by a disciple who was a Hindu, Surat Singh. And Surat Singh has written, the script is Persian, language is also Persian, but within that Persian, I mean, the examples which Bangha was showing us today, that half the sentences Persian, the half is borrowed from the Indian languages. Same type of thing, has been done in this Tazkiratul Khadam or Tazkira Pir Suteli. Uh, Yet another example of this intermingling is found in there is one Tarikh of Bilgram, which although was written sometime during early 18th century, but it contains a large number of documents which are original, which date back to Akbar's period or Jahangir's period or Shah Jahan's period. This is an account of the Qazis of Bilgram. So they have included all type of original documents. So it becomes a primary source for us. There, during Shah Jahan's time, there is an incident. I am forgetting the name of a noble of Shah Jahan's period who is traveling via Bilgram, and en route he is informed that a scholar such and such is delivering a lecture today in a madrasa at Bilgram. Now, this particular noble has heard a lot about this particular scholar, so he decides that I am going to attend the lecture and hear what he is going to talk about. And then the noting is that I went there but couldn't understand a word because the lecture was being delivered in Hindavi. Now, what that Hindavi was, we are not informed. But the fact remains that by Shah Jahan's time, even in the madrasas, there was a new language in which the students, and remember, we are talking about the family Qazis of Bilgram. So they are all Muslims. The madrasa is a Muslim madrasa with a mullah, a Qazi, who's also a scholar giving, a lecture, but the lecture is not in Persian. It is being delivered in Hindavi. And naturally, when you start delivering lectures and talking in that language, and there are many, many examples of that, there is a need to even have a script. And that is why, as Imre Bangha has shown today, that sometimes, as he rightly pointed out, that the script which is used is Nagari. But within that, the language which is being written is a mixture of Persian and the local. In Jaipur, I also came across Dr. Bangha, a number of books which are written similarly in Nagari script, but they are almost so Persianized that no scholar of Hindi or Rajasthani can actually decipher them. Right? But in the same collection of the Jain temples, I found a number of manuscripts which were in the Persian script, but the language which was used there was Hindustani or whatever you call them. So, this is what was happening in the pre-modern period. When we talk about pre-modern times, we generally think of strife. We generally think of rapine and murder. The fact remains that possibly some aspects of our medieval period were much better than what we are today during the 21st century, where we are all divided on the basis of caste and religion, where we are all divided and fighting against each other on the basis of whether I know Urdu or Hindi. As Dr. Bangha pointed out, that there were common origins of these languages. It is very hard before 19th century or late 18th century to differentiate what is Urdu. In fact, when he started the lecture, he told us about a verse from Baburnama, which he said that sometimes people call it Urdu. I would refrain from using that term Urdu because that is, during that period, there is hardly any reference of any Urdu being developed. That is just a modern construct which we try to reflect back. Thank you, Dr. Bangha, for such an illuminating lecture. You really took out time for us. We will always remain obliged to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.